The main street of Dodge City had seen its share of gunfights, cattle drives, and drunken brawls, but on that particular afternoon, all eyes were fixed on the widow in black and the towering stallion beside her. Dust swirled in the wind, the kind that clung to clothes and stung the eyes, yet no one dared to look away. The animal was a monster of muscle and fury, a black-coated beast with eyes burning like coals. Every attempt to ride him had ended the same. Men thrown into the dirt, some limping away, others carried to the doctor's office on makeshift stretchers. The widow stood tall, her chin high, her gaze sharper than the edge of a bowie knife. "If you're a real cowboy, prove it on my stallion," she had said, her words slicing through the murmurs like a whip crack, and the challenge hung heavy. In the air, like a dare no man had yet met. The men in the crowd, ranch hands and drifters alike, exchanged nervous glances. Some muttered under their breath, cursing the arrogance of the widow who dared to taunt them, while others smirked, pretending they hadn't secretly hoped to tame the beast themselves. But everyone knew the truth. This stallion was no ordinary horse. He had been her late husband's pride, a creature too wild to be broken, too stubborn to obey any man. Since his death, the horse had become a symbol of her grief and her pride, a test of courage she threw before the world. One after another, men had failed, their bones and pride scattered in the dirt. And still the stallion stood, snorting and pawing at the ground, as if mocking every fool who tried. The widow's eyes scanned the crowd again, challenging them, her voice unshaken by loss. "Well, is there no real cowboy left in this town?" From the shadows near the saloon, Caleb adjusted the brim of his hat. He was a man with dust on his boots and weariness etched into his face, a drifter who had seen more of the West's cruelty than most cared to. He hadn't come to Dodge City for contests or challenges. He had come looking for work, maybe a drink, maybe just a place to rest for the night. Yet something in the widow's words struck him. Not the insult, not the pride, but the weight of sorrow behind them. He knew that kind of grief, the kind that made a person search for meaning in impossible things. Slowly, deliberately, he tugged his gloves tighter, the leather creaking softly. The whispers began immediately. "Another. A fool," someone muttered. "He won't last 2 seconds." But Caleb didn't answer. His boots crunched against the dust as he stepped forward, his gaze fixed not on the crowd, not even on the widow, but on the stallion whose fury had become legend. The stallion reared as Caleb approached, his hooves striking the air, nostrils flaring as though to warn the stranger away. The crowd gasped and pulled back, fearing the animal might lash out and trample anyone in reach. Caleb, however, did not flinch. His movements were calm, measured, as though he had walked this path before with beasts just as untamed. He stopped a few feet short, his eyes steady, his shoulders loose. For a long, tense moment, man and horse regarded each other in silence, one filled with fire, the other with a patience that only hardship could carve into a man. Caleb let the silence stretch, let the stallion test him with snorts and pawing. Hooves, before taking another slow step closer. The murmurs grew louder now. "He's mad," one man scoffed. "He'll be thrown before his boots touch the stirrups." But Caleb's jaw set like stone, his focus unshaken. The widow's gaze flickered between the stallion and the stranger who dared approach. She had seen plenty of men swagger forward with confidence, only to crawl away broken. But there was something different in this one's stride. No arrogance, no boasting, no drunken bravado. He moved like a man with nothing to prove to the crowd, and yet everything to prove to himself. She folded her arms, her voice cutting through the whispers. "You know the price of failure," she warned. "The stallion doesn't forgive weakness." Caleb lifted his eyes to hers for a heartbeat, nodding once, silently acknowledging both the warning and the challenge. Then his attention returned to the beast. He reached slowly for the reins, letting the stallion feel his presence, letting him test the weight of his patience. The crowd leaned forward, every breath caught in suspense. Caleb was no fool. He knew the risk, but something deep inside him whispered that this was a test not of strength, but of spirit, and he had come too far in life to turn back now. The stallion's muscles rippled as Caleb's hand brushed the reins, his ears pinned, back teeth bared in defiance. A low growl of tension swept the onlookers, half expecting to see blood drawn in an instant. Caleb murmured softly, words lost beneath the wind, his voice steady, soothing, a sound meant for the horse alone. He knew the crowd wanted a show of dominance, but he wasn't here to dominate. He was here to connect, to meet fire with calm. The stallion shifted uneasily, snorting as if unsure what to make of this quiet stranger. Caleb waited, still as stone, letting the horse test him, letting him feel that he would not break nor strike. Slowly, carefully, Caleb placed his boot into the stirrup. The crowd erupted in a mix of cheers and jeers, bets flying across the street, coins clinking as men wagered how long he'd last, but Caleb heard none of it. For him, there was only the stallion, the dust, and the pounding rhythm of his own heart as he swung into the saddle. The horse exploded beneath him like a storm unleashed. Hooves struck dirt, muscles coiled and bucked, the ground itself trembling beneath the force of his rage. Caleb's grip tightened, his body moving with the beast, not against it. The crowd shouted, voices a blur, but his mind was locked in silence, every ounce of his focus drawn into the battle between man and horse. The widow's eyes widened despite herself, her breath catching as she watched the stranger hold fast where so many had been thrown. His movements were not harsh, not cruel. He rode with balance, with a patience that matched the stallion's fury, stride for stride. Dust rose in clouds around them, choking the air, but still Caleb remained. For the first time in weeks, the widow felt the spark of something she thought long buried, hope, raw and unexpected, rising with the rhythm of hooves and the grit of a man who refused to let go. The stallion exploded into motion. The instant Caleb's weight settled in the saddle, his hooves tearing at the ground, his muscles bunching like coiled steel. He leapt, bucked, and twisted, a storm of fury that had broken 25 men before. The crowd roared in a frenzy, some cheering, others mocking, but Caleb heard none of it. His jaw clenched, his hands firm yet gentle on the reins, his body moving with the rhythm of the beast. Dust spiraled into the sky, swallowing horse and rider in a choking haze, but within it, Caleb's calm heart spoke louder than the stallion's rage. Where others had fought to dominate, Caleb simply endured, steady and unyielding, giving the stallion no enemy to fight, no weakness to exploit. Minutes stretched into eternities as the horse tried every trick, rearing high, twisting, kicking sideways, even collapsing and surging back up with terrifying strength. Still, Caleb did not falter. His balance was born not of arrogance, but of years spent on ranches, in storms, in battles with beasts that tested more than just muscle. His voice, low and steady, carried words no one else could hear, words meant only for the animal thrashing beneath him. Slowly, impossibly, the stallion's rage began to crack. The violent surges gave way to heavy breathing, each snort less like defiance and more like exhaustion. The crowd, once rowdy with jeers, had gone eerily silent, every eye fixed on the sight of the beast slowing beneath the stranger's hands. At last, the stallion stopped, hooves planted firmly in the dirt, sides heaving with sweat and dust. Caleb sat tall in the saddle, his chest rising and falling with his own labored breaths, his hat tilted low against the sun. For a moment, the silence was absolute, broken only by the horse's weary snorts. Then, as realization sank in, the crowd erupted, not in mockery, not in laughter, but in stunned disbelief. Men who had sworn the stallion could never be tamed now found themselves swallowing their pride, while others muttered in awe, as though they had witnessed a miracle. Caleb reached forward, his hand brushing the horse's damp neck. The animal did not shy, did not rear. He merely stood, accepting. In that touch, the battle ended not in conquest, but in trust. The widow had stood frozen since the first buck, her arms crossed against her chest as though shielding herself from hope. For weeks, she had watched men fail, had dared others to try, and each failure had confirmed what she already believed, that no man could tame what her husband had left behind. The stallion was her test, her barrier, her way of keeping grief from consuming her. Yet as she watched Caleb ride steady, her heart trembled for the first time since the day she had buried her husband. She stepped forward, her boots crunching. In the dirt, her eyes locked on the man who had succeeded where all others had fallen. When the crowd's roar faded, her voice carried softly across the space. "You're the only man who tamed him," she said, her tone no longer sharp, but touched with wonder. Then with a faint, trembling smile, she added, "And maybe the only one who can tame me." Caleb swung down from the saddle, landing lightly on the dirt, though his legs trembled with fatigue. He removed his hat, wiping sweat from his brow before meeting the widow's gaze. Her eyes, once cold and guarded, now glistened with something she hadn't let anyone see in years. The crowd held its breath, sensing something far more powerful than a mere contest had taken place. Caleb did not speak immediately, his silence saying more than words ever could. Then he placed the reins into her hand, a quiet gesture of respect, as if to tell her the horse was not his to claim. The widow's fingers closed around the leather, but her eyes never left his. For the first time, she saw not just a rider, but a man who carried strength without cruelty, patience without weakness. The townsfolk began to disperse, their chatter a mixture of awe, envy, and speculation. Some muttered about the stranger's luck, others about the widow's boldness. But none of it mattered. The world beyond them seemed to blur as Caleb and the widow stood in the settling dust, bound by something forged in those wild, frantic minutes. She reached up, brushing her fingers lightly against the stallion's damp neck, then looked back at Caleb. "He trusted you," she whispered almost to herself. Caleb's reply was low, steady. "He only needed someone to listen." The widow's lips curved into the faintest smile, a smile that felt like the first crack of dawn after a long night. Days passed, and the tale of the cowboy who tamed the widow's stallion spread through Dodge City and beyond. Some called him a fool, others a hero, but Caleb paid little mind to either. What mattered was the quiet that followed, the evenings spent by the widow's porch with the stallion grazing nearby, and the unspoken bond growing between two souls who had carried their own grief too long. She cooked meals again, her laughter, soft but real, while Caleb mended fences and tended to chores with the steady patience of a man who had finally found a place to stop wandering. Their silence was no longer heavy, but comfortable, filled with the warmth of something unspoken. It was not long before the widow, whose name, Clara, was spoken again with respect instead of pity, began to walk beside Caleb in town, her black dress replaced with colors of life she had once abandoned. The whispers of scandal faded into acceptance, for no one could deny the way she looked at him, nor the way he stood at her side. The stallion, once untamable, became the symbol of their union, his wildness tempered by trust, his strength shared between them. Clara no longer needed to test men for courage, for she had found hers in the quiet strength of the drifter who refused to break. And Caleb, once a lonely wanderer, had found more than a challenge. He had found a home, a woman, and a reason to belong. Under the vast Kansas sky, where sunsets bled across the horizon and the wind carried both sorrow and promise, Caleb and Clara stood side by side, their hands brushing, their lives forever altered. Their story was whispered in saloons and sung around campfires, a tale of a cowboy who tamed the untamable and a widow who discovered that love could rise again from ashes. It was not a story of conquest, but of respect, courage, and trust. Of two hearts that, like the stallion, had been wild with grief, yet learned to run free together. And as they rode across the prairie, the crowd's jeers and doubts faded like dust in the wind, leaving only the truth the desert itself seemed to carry. Sometimes the fiercest battles lead not to scars, but to love.